Hello, third graders. I wanted to share another chapter of Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball by Debbie Dady and Marcia Thornton Jones. Today we are going to be reading chapter 7. Let's recap chapter 6. We saw another character, Howie's grandmother. She is from Ireland and knows about leprechauns, which is something the students at Bailey School are very interested in learning about. We can use the somebody wanted but so then organizer to help us with the summary. So previously in Leprechauns Don't Play Basketball, Howie and his friends were curious about Mrs. Jeepers' actions. They wanted to find out more about leprechauns from Howie's grandmother. But she starts to tell them some stories. Howie interrupts and tells his grandma to tell the true story of the leprechauns. So then Howie's grandmother tells the children that leprechauns are most peculiar fairy folk. She also mentions that a rainbow is a leprechaun stairway to the Emerald Isle. I also noticed that when the true leprechaun story came up, she frowned. It was almost like Mrs. Jeepers, where she was a little bit disturbed too at the thought of leprechauns. Let's see what happens in chapter 7. Chapter 7 is called The True Story of the Wee Folk, and the Wee Folk is another name for leprechauns. So let's find out what the true story is. Chapter 7, The True Story of the Wee Folk. Now I'm looking at the picture, and it looks like this person is wearing a crown, so that makes me think that he's a king, and he looks like he might be a king. So maybe the king of the leprechauns. Long ago, leprechauns could be found throughout the world, Howie's grandmother began. The leprechaun emperor ruled the lands by possession of the stolen fairy stone. There are many kinds of magic stones, red, blue, and even purple. But the most powerful one of all is the fairy stone. It holds a strong magic. The stone does. So powerful that the leprechauns become a nuisance with it. They traveled the world, tricking anyone they could. What was the stone like? Melanie asked. The fairy stone is as green as the grass underfoot and the trees overhead, and the leprechauns were proud to have it. The emperor wore it as the throat of his scarlet robe. Scarlet? Hetty nearly shouted. But that's red. Everybody knows leprechauns wear green. Howie's grandmother shook her head. Not in those long ago times. They only began to wear green when they went into hiding. Why did they go into hiding? Howie asked. 'Twas the fault of the vampires. Vampires! All four kids yelled at once. Now remember, the kids think that Mrs. Jeepers is a vampire. Aye, Howie's grandmother nodded seriously. The vampires grew tired of the leprechaun's tricky ways, so they decided to get the fairy stone away from the wee folk. What happened? Melody asked. How did the vampires get the fairy stone from the leprechauns? They were tricked, Howie's grandmother exclaimed. The vampires sent a spy to live in the emperor's castle. The spy gained their trust and then sneaked into the emperor's bedroom, taking the fairy stone whilst he slept. Now I'm looking at the picture, and the picture looks like a lady. But that's stealing, Liza cried. Howie's grandmother shook her head. The truth of the matter is that the fairy stone rightfully belonged to the vampires, and once they got it back, the vampires banished all leprechauns to the Emerald Isle. 'Tis then that the leprechauns began to wear green and to hide amongst the trees and bushes. Some say it was because of shame, and to this day most leprechauns of Ireland are too ashamed to look at you. Some say you can control a leprechaun if you get him to look in your eyes. But didn't the leprechauns try to get the stone back? Eddie asked. Aye, and they're still a trying to this day, Howie's grandmother said. But 'tis only 3 days that the leprechauns can be a missing from the Emerald Isle. 1 day for each leaflet of the shamrock. The vampires saw fit to punish them that way. Was it Count Dracula who got the stone back for the vampires? Eddie asked. Is that who the emperor trusted? Ellie's grandmother looked at each one of them, and then she answered in a whisper. It was a teacher that tricked the emperor, the teacher of his very own children. Children were silent as they left the room. Out on the front porch, Howie whispered, That's it. What? Howie asked. Didn't you hear what my grandmother said? A vampire who just happens to be a teacher stole the fairy stone from the leprechauns. So? Melody shrugged. So, the vampire teacher is Mrs. Jeepers, Howie explained. And she stole the fairy stone. You know that weird green brooch she always wears? That's the magic stone. And I bet those stones in Mr. O'Grady's pouch are magic too. You don't know that, Melanie insisted. We don't even know Mrs. Jeepers is a vampire. Does sort of fit together, Liza said thoughtfully. Of course it does, Howie nodded his head. And that means Mr. O'Grady really is a leprechaun, and he's come to get the stone back. It's just a fairy tale, Eddie disagreed. It's all a bunch of blarney. You won't think so if we have a leprechaun and vampire war right in the halls of Bailey Elementary, Howie said seriously. All the kids were silent as they thought about what he said. If that's true, Melanie whispered, we've got to do something to stop it. But what can we do? Howie asked. We're just a bunch of kids. Maybe we should tell our parents, Liza suggested. Nobody would believe us, Melody said. They'd think we're gone completely bonkers. We've got to think of something, Howie said, before it's too late. I know what I'm going to do, Eddie interrupted. I'll prove Mr. O'Grady isn't a leprechaun. And that is the end of the chapter. I wonder what Eddie is going to do. Make a prediction to think about what you think he will do. Do you think that Mrs. Jeepers is a vampire? Do you think Mr. O'Grady is a leprechaun? See you next chapter.